We're here today because of the crash of Delta Flight 4819. Can you please tell us your name
I'm Mark Pierce.
and where do you work, Mark?
I work at DJC Law. I'm an aviation attorney.
Mark, in Toronto, Delta Airlines 4819 crashed upon landing. Can you talk about crosswind landings and what pilots have to look out for when they're making a crosswind landing?
We know from the weather reports, and obviously if you've seen the video, that the weather was not good that day. And the report is that there was a right crosswind. In other words, if you're looking down the runway, the wind is coming strongly from the right side. And to keep the airplane straight, the pilot has to dip that right wing down a little bit and use rudder and wing to counteract the force of the wind. Otherwise, it literally pushes the airplane off the center line.
And so, in counteracting the wind, does the pilot have to crab?
Crabbing is one way to do it, which is literally just pointing the nose sideways. The other is a slip, where you dip the wing and hold the airplane straight with the rudder pedal. Both ways are taught in flight school. Different airlines teach different ways. They have different expectations for how their pilots handle those. It's a technique.
And when you're looking at an airplane's operating handbook, do planes have different maximum crosswinds allowed for a particular airplane?
Absolutely, and it's called a demonstrated crosswind component. The airplane is flown in maximum conditions. A demonstrated component is the amount of crosswind that has been shown by an expert test pilot to be controllable up to a certain limit. It doesn't mean the airplane couldn't fly beyond that limit with excellent piloting, but there's a safe margin there that demonstrated component shows that if you keep it within that margin and fly with proper technique, then you ought to be able to safely land the airplane.
In this accident, from what we've been able to see of the video that was shot by a plane that was at the departure end of the runway waiting to take off, it looks like it was a fairly hard landing on the main landing gear. Can you talk about the importance of maintenance with regards to landing gear and whether or not it will be important to review the maintenance logs?
Sure. There are very tight regulations on how often these aircraft have to be inspected and the tolerances for any discrepancies detected by the mechanics. The landing gear are regularly inspected. The tires take a lot of abuse, particularly on landings. Tires don't last on an airplane nearly as long as they do on your car. So those have to be looked at frequently. Here we saw the landing gear collapse, and they will certainly be inspected to see if they should have withstood the amount of force applied on the landing, or whether they were just stressed beyond their limits.
Certainly, we don't want to blame the pilot or anyone in the cockpit of this plane at this time without having more information as to what happened. We don't want to blame the pilot or first officer of this plane at this time without knowing more and without further investigation into this accident. Can you talk about the experience that these flight crew have in regional jets as opposed to the major airlines with the larger jets?
These crew, they are professional pilots. They are certified. They've passed all of the exams and testing. They have their medical certifications. They are qualified to do the job. The reality is that the regional jet, the CRJ is a regional jet, that's what RJ stands for. It's considered a stepping stone in the aviation industry to gain experience and knowledge to sort of graduate into bigger jets. The big jets that fly internationally, and a lot of us fly from one big city to another, those pilots may well have spent some time flying regional jets. With that experience, we're able to get a job flying bigger aircraft.
Now, this flight was going from Minneapolis, St. Paul to Toronto. Will that bring into account with regards to the legal aspects of these cases, any international regulations or any international conventions with regards to limitations on liability, et cetera?
It does. The Montreal Convention is the governing international treaty in these situations, and the sort of the onus is on the airline to establish it was not their fault. a passenger who is injured in an international flight such as this one need only establish that they were hurt. If the airline wants to deny their claim, they have to prove that the airline had no fault. Hard to do in a situation like this where it's all on video. There are limits to that strict liability where they have to pay a certain amount. But if the injuries are severe enough, if it involves a death or extremely serious injury, an aviation lawyer that knows the law and has handled these kind of cases will go beyond the Montreal Convention, that first limitation, and go ahead and accept the burden of proof to show the airline was in fact negligent. Then essentially their damages are not capped. In other words, the limit is whatever they can prove the harm that was done to them and their family.
Unfortunately, in this accident, it doesn't appear that anybody was killed. There were some severe injuries. Can you talk a little bit about your experience and the people that you've represented in the past who have had significant impact, PTSD, mental anguish, damages, no physical injuries, but how this can impact somebody from a psychological perspective as opposed to a physical perspective because they've been through such a traumatic experience?
Sure. Most people have heard of PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. It's hard to imagine what it felt like for the people on this airplane to be coming in for what looked like a normal landing. The next thing they know, they're skidding and flames are surrounding them, and then they're upside down. They don't know what's happening. It happened very suddenly. They've got to release themselves from a seatbelt and drop down to what's now the floor is the ceiling. And it would be surprising that most of the people on the airplane weren't in total shock. Some people might recover from that readily. There are others that will live with that memory and the stress and the anxiety forever for the rest of their lives.
Thank you, Mark.